I want to start with something uncomfortable. And I say uncomfortable because most people watching this have already tried the obvious things. You've eaten less. You've walked more. You've cut out the biscuits, the bread, maybe even the wine. And the belly fat is still there. Not just there, for a lot of people over 60, it's actually more stubborn than it was 5 years ago, despite doing more of the right things. Here is what I need you to understand before we go any further. If that is your experience, you are not failing. You are not lacking willpower. You are doing things that feel logical, things that would have worked in your 40s, but that are now working against you, specifically because of what happens to your hormonal system after 60. There are 5 habits in particular that are making belly fat worse after 60. Not obviously bad habits, not junk food and no exercise. 5 habits that most people consider neutral or even healthy. And every single one of them is elevating a hormone called cortisol, which after menopause has a direct, documented structural relationship with fat accumulation in the abdomen. We are going to go through all 5. For each one, Suki is going to explain exactly why it is working against you hormonally, and I am going to tell you what to do instead, because there is no point in telling you to stop something without giving you a specific replacement. By the end of this video, you will have a clear picture of what is driving the problem and a practical protocol you can begin adjusting this week.
Hi, I'm Suki Yamamoto, wellness specialist. And before we get into the 5 habits, I want to spend a few minutes on the cortisol mechanism. Because if you don't understand why cortisol matters specifically after 60, the 5 habits won't make complete sense. And I want them to make complete sense.
And I'm Marcus Reid, your senior health coach. No fads, no miracle claims, just what the research actually shows and what it looks like in practice. Suki, cortisol. A lot of people have heard the word. Most people vaguely associate it with stress. But can you explain why it becomes such a specific problem for belly fat after 60?
Cortisol is your primary stress hormone. It is produced by the adrenal glands in response to any kind of stress on the body: physical stress, psychological stress, sleep deprivation, caloric restriction. Any state your body perceives as a threat triggers cortisol release in a healthy, acute stress response that is entirely appropriate. Cortisol mobilizes energy, sharpens focus, prepares you to respond. The problem is chronic elevation, when cortisol stays high consistently over time, rather than spiking and returning to baseline. Here is the connection to belly fat specifically. Visceral fat, the fat that accumulates around the organs in the abdominal area, has a higher density of cortisol receptors than fat in other parts of the body. This was documented clearly in research by Per Bjørntorp, published in the Journal of Internal Medicine in 1991. Fat cells in the visceral region are more responsive to cortisol. When cortisol is chronically elevated, it signals those cells specifically to store more fat, and it impairs the normal processes by which visceral fat is released and burned.
So it's not just that you're gaining fat everywhere. Cortisol is directing fat specifically to the abdomen.
It is a targeted effect, and here is why this becomes significantly worse after menopause specifically. Estrogen has a moderating effect on cortisol. It buffers the cortisol response. It prevents it from staying elevated as long or as high. When estrogen declines after menopause, that buffer is weakened. The same stressors that your body previously managed with moderate cortisol responses now produce stronger, longer cortisol spikes. A study by Alyssa Eppel and colleagues, published in Psychosomatic Medicine in 2000, demonstrated this explicitly. Women with higher waist-to-hip ratios showed greater cortisol responses to psychological stress compared to women with lower central fat. The relationship runs in both directions. More visceral fat creates more cortisol sensitivity, which drives more visceral fat. It is a self-reinforcing cycle.
Which is exactly why doing more of what worked before can stop working, or make things worse. If the interventions you are using are themselves elevating cortisol, you are feeding the cycle instead of breaking it.
That is the framework, and it is the reason the 5 habits we are about to discuss are not intuitive. They are things most people would not associate with cortisol at all.
Habit 1, and I'll say it plainly. This one surprised me when I first understood the mechanism. Chronic cardio, Long, steady-state cardio done most days of the week. Walking for an hour every day. Classes at the gym 3 or 4 times a week. This is belly fat habit number 1.
I want to be precise here because I don't want people to hear stop exercising. That is not the message. Moderate, regular movement is unambiguously beneficial. What the research identifies as problematic is a specific pattern, prolonged, moderate intensity continuous exercise, the kind that keeps your heart rate elevated for 45 minutes to an hour or more, performed frequently without adequate recovery time. In this pattern, cortisol does not fully return to baseline between sessions. It accumulates.
So it's not the exercise itself, it's the pattern.
It is the pattern combined with the post-60 hormonal context. Before menopause, estrogen's buffering effect helps cortisol recover faster. After menopause, that recovery is slower. The same exercise routine that served you well in your 50s can produce a chronic cortisol load in your 60s. A systematic review published in Frontiers in Endocrinology in 2023 by Woodward and colleagues found that resistance training, not cardio, was the modality most consistently associated with visceral fat reduction in postmenopausal women. The studies comparing resistance training directly to aerobic training in this population consistently favored resistance training for abdominal fat specifically.
What to do instead? 2 to 3 sessions per week of resistance training. Body weight, resistance bands, light weights, 30 minutes. Effort that is genuinely challenging in the final repetitions. And if you want to keep your walking, keep it. But treat it as recovery movement, not your primary fat loss intervention. That distinction matters.
It matters because the mechanism is different. Walking keeps you mobile and manages blood sugar moderately. Resistance training produces hormonal responses, growth hormone, IGF-1, that directly counteract cortisol's fat storage effect. They are doing different jobs.
Habit 2. Eating significantly less to try to lose the fat. This is the most counterintuitive one because it is the most obvious thing to try. Belly fat is stored energy. Eat less, burn more, the maths make sense.
The mathematics is correct in isolation. The biology does not cooperate. When caloric intake drops significantly below what your body requires, your body reads that as a survival threat. Cortisol rises. This is a consistent, documented response. It is your body's mechanism for mobilizing alternative energy sources when food is scarce. The problem is that cortisol mobilized in this context does not selectively burn abdominal fat. It can trigger muscle breakdown for energy. It elevates blood glucose, and critically, it reinforces visceral fat storage as a biological hedge against continued scarcity.
So the body is protecting the belly fat specifically because it perceives a shortage.
Yes, this was observed in research by Dahlman and colleagues published in Brain Behavior and Immunity in 2004. Under chronic stress and restriction, the body preferentially stores energy in visceral depots. The mechanism appears to be evolutionary. Visceral fat is the most rapidly accessible stored energy in an emergency. The body is optimizing for survival, not for the aesthetic outcome the person is looking for. There is also the issue of muscle mass. After 60, muscle mass is already declining at a meaningful rate, approximately 1 to 2% per year. Severe calorie restriction accelerates that loss. Less muscle means lower resting metabolic rate, which means fewer calories burned at rest. The deficit that was supposed to drive fat loss instead erodes the metabolic engine.
What to do instead? Eat enough. I know that is not what anyone wants to hear, but eat enough, with protein as your anchor. The research consistently supports protein intake of approximately 1.2 to 1.6 grams per kilogram of body weight per day for adults over 60 who are active. That is significantly more than most people are eating. High protein intake preserves muscle during any caloric deficit. It has a high thermic effect, meaning your body burns more calories digesting it than it does digesting fat or carbohydrate, and it produces satiety signals that regulate appetite without the cortisol spike of restriction. If you are going to eat less, eat slightly less, and make most of what you eat protein. I want to pause here for a moment, because I know that some of what we are saying runs directly counter to advice you may have followed for years. Less food, more cardio. That was the standard guidance for decades, and for many people in their 40s, it produced results. The reason it stops working after 60 is not that you are doing it wrong. It is that the hormonal environment in which those rules operated has changed. The same inputs now produce different outputs. What we are describing is not a new fad. It is the logical consequence of updated research on postmenopausal physiology.
Habit 3. Disrupted or insufficient sleep. And I want to be careful here because sleep problems after 60 are often not a choice. They are a consequence of the same hormonal changes we have been discussing. I am not suggesting people are choosing to sleep badly. I'm explaining why it matters and what the leverage points are. When sleep is insufficient or fragmented, and research tends to define insufficient as under 7 hours for most adults, cortisol production the following day is measurably higher than after adequate sleep. A study by Lasikiewicz and colleagues published in Psychoneuroendocrinology found that sleep restriction significantly elevated morning cortisol, with effects that persisted through the day. A more recent and striking study by Kovacine and colleagues, published in the Journal of the American College of Cardiology in 2022, specifically measured visceral fat accumulation in response to sleep restriction. Participants who slept 4 to 6 hours per night for 8 weeks showed a statistically significant increase in visceral fat compared to adequate sleepers, not subcutaneous fat, not overall weight, specifically visceral abdominal fat.
So poor sleep is not just making you tired, it is actively depositing fat in your abdomen.
Through the cortisol pathway, yes, and in postmenopausal women, this is compounded. Hot flushes and night sweats fragment sleep architecture, reducing the deep restorative sleep stages where cortisol is lowest and growth hormone is highest. It is another self-reinforcing mechanism.
What to do instead? 3 specific sleep levers that the research supports. First, consistent sleep and wake times. Not just consistent bedtime, consistent wake time. Your cortisol rhythm is entrained to your wake time. Varying it by more than an hour on weekends, what researchers call social jet lag, disrupts the cortisol cycle for days afterward. Second, temperature. Core body temperature needs to drop to initiate deep sleep. A room temperature of 18 to 20 degrees Celsius is consistently associated with better sleep architecture in older adults. This is especially relevant if hot flushes are disrupting sleep. Cooling the environment gives the body the best possible conditions for the deep stages it needs. Third, no screens in the 90 minutes before bed. Not because of blue light alone, because of cognitive arousal. The stimulation of news, social media, and reactive content keeps cortisol elevated into the sleep window. 90 minutes without screens is a structural boundary, not a recommendation. Habit 4, ultra-processed carbohydrates. And I want to be specific here, because Suki is going to explain a double mechanism. This one hits cortisol and something else.
Ultra-processed carbohydrates. I'm talking about refined breakfast cereals, commercial bread, crackers, low-fat flavored yogurts, energy bars marketed as healthy, rice cakes. These foods share 2 properties that are relevant here. First, they produce rapid high spikes in blood glucose. Your body responds with a surge of insulin to manage that glucose. When insulin surges repeatedly, cells in the body can begin to lose sensitivity to it, a state called insulin resistance. Visceral fat both causes and is worsened by insulin resistance. The relationship is bidirectional. Second, and this is the cortisol connection, processed foods, particularly those high in sugar, activate the same neural reward pathways as other stressors. Research by Eppel and colleagues published in Psychoneuroendocrinology in 2014 demonstrated that stress and cortisol drive cravings specifically for high-sugar, high-fat foods. This creates a cycle where cortisol elevation drives processed food consumption, which elevates insulin and blood glucose, which drives more fat storage, which elevates cortisol further.
So the healthy low-fat snack with the long ingredient list is not neutral. It is actively participating in the cycle.
The healthy framing is often the problem. A food labeled low-fat can still be very high in refined carbohydrate, and in the context of postmenopausal insulin sensitivity, that is the more relevant variable.
What to do instead? This is not a call for zero carbohydrate. It is a call for unprocessed carbohydrate sources. Sweet potato instead of rice cakes. Oats, whole rolled oats, not instant, instead of commercial cereal. Lentils and legumes, which are high in both resistant starch and protein. Whole fruit instead of fruit-flavored products. The practical test is simple. If the product has more than 5 ingredients and you cannot identify most of them by sight, it is probably ultra-processed. Not every meal needs to pass that test, but if the majority of your carbohydrate sources do, you will have meaningfully reduced both the insulin and cortisol burden over time. Habit 5, and this is the one that most health content completely ignores. Treating stress as a purely psychological problem, something you manage with mindset, with positive thinking, with learning to worry less. When in fact, chronic stress is a physical, hormonal, measurable state, and it requires physical interventions, not just mental ones.
This matters because the advice to reduce stress is rarely actionable. It tells people what outcome to achieve without telling them how the system works or how to intervene in it. The HPA axis, hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, is the biological system that produces cortisol in response to stress. In chronically stressed individuals, this axis becomes dysregulated. The feedback mechanism that is supposed to tell it to stop producing cortisol when the stressor has passed becomes less sensitive. This is not a psychological state. It is a measurable biological condition. What the research identifies as effective physical interventions for HPA axis regulation includes resistance exercise, which we have already discussed, diaphragmatic breathing, specifically slow breathing, at approximately 5 to 6 breaths per minute for 10 minutes daily, which has been shown in multiple trials to activate the parasympathetic nervous system and reduce cortisol output, and social connection, which is not soft advice. Loneliness and social isolation produce measurable HPA axis activation. They are physiological stressors, not merely emotional ones.
What to do instead? Take the biological seriously. 10 minutes of slow, deliberate breathing. In for 4 counts, hold for 2, out for 6. Done daily, produces measurable cortisol reduction. That is not meditation in the philosophical sense. That is a ventilation exercise with a documented hormonal effect. The social connection piece is worth naming specifically. If you are retired, if you are living alone, if social contact has reduced significantly compared to 10 or 15 years ago, that absence is registering in your body as a biological stressor. Reconnecting socially is not optional wellness advice. It is a hormonal intervention. Let me bring this together. 5 habits. The mechanism behind all 5 of them is cortisol, specifically the postmenopausal hormonal environment in which cortisol rises faster, stays higher, and deposits fat specifically in the abdomen. Habit 1. Chronic cardio without resistance training. Replace with 2 to 3 sessions of resistance training per week as your primary fat loss modality. Habit 2. Severe calorie restriction. Replace with adequate protein, 1.2 to 1.6 grams per kilogram of body weight, and moderate rather than aggressive deficit. Habit 3. Disrupted sleep. 3 leverage points. Consistent wake time. Cooler room temperature. No screens 90 minutes before bed. Habit 4. Ultra-processed carbohydrates. Replace with unprocessed sources. Whole oats, sweet potato, legumes, whole fruit. Habit 5. Treating stress as psychological. 10 minutes of slow diaphragmatic breathing daily. Prioritizing social connection as a physiological intervention, not an optional one.
I want to add one thing, and I think it is the most important contextual point in this entire video. None of these changes produce results in a week. Some people will make these changes and feel frustrated after a month because the belly fat has not noticeably reduced. Here is what I want you to understand about that. Visceral fat is metabolically active, which means it does respond to these interventions, but it responds over months, not days. The studies that documented visceral fat reduction through resistance training ran for 12 to 24 weeks. The sleep research ran for 8 weeks. These are not instant solutions. What you are doing with these 5 changes is removing the conditions that are actively causing the accumulation. That is the first and necessary step. Reduction follows removal of cause, but it follows on the body's timeline, not ours.
One more thing. Most people watching this will find that one of these 5 habits is their main driver, not all 5 equally. It is worth asking honestly, which one is most likely mine? The chronic cardio, the restriction, the sleep, the processed carbs, the unmanaged stress? Start there. One consistent change is more powerful than 5 inconsistent ones. If this video explains something that has been frustrating you, and I think it probably did for a lot of people, the like button genuinely helps more people over 60 find this information. It costs you nothing, and it matters more than most people realize. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss what we cover next.